You know, what really kind of sticks out at me is, you know, you mentioned infrastructure and who funds it. Well, if you look at, for example, the United States as a template, or the Western world, really, even Europe, we know that the private sector usually funds up to 80% of public infrastructure. Do you think that there's something within kind of the Nigerian institutional framework that is inhibiting private sector investment in national infrastructure?
Private sector is skittish to environment that has not thought through how to balance risk and reward. And in many ways, the private sector not being Santa Claus, by the way, Happy New Year, you know, it's not Santa Claus, it's not Father Christmas. Therefore, it does not understand rhetorics. It does not respond to opportunities on the basis of, you know, we think it would be a good idea for the private sector. No, the private sector is that, you know, I mean, like, you can say they are very mercantilist in their approach. That's what they exist to do. So why is it that we have not been able to mobilize? Because the real mobilization for development would happen when government improves the quality of economic thought that we have as to how to disrupt our stagnant structure. And when you think of stagnant structure, think in terms of the productivity of important sectors in our economy. It's still, you know, in real basis, real numbers, you would find that we're still not doing well at all as much as we should do. So if that is the case, the 28 to 30 trillion that we need to invest in infrastructure annually, my goodness, you have to completely, radically change your philosophy of governance. You have to change your incentive system within the economic sphere of your nation. You have to completely understand the limits and the roles of the sectors and then how they collaborate.
I want to go into the president's address and kind of address some of the substance there. You know, one of the things that really kind of came up is he focused on two key areas when he talked about infrastructure. He focused on power works and housing, and he focused on transportation. We know that in the 2018 budget, those received the top two allocations, $555 billion for power and works, $260 approximately for transportation. Do you think that those two should be the emphasis of a federal government in Nigeria?
I think the federal government is really the only arm of government that can do massive investment.
But is it the right focus, though?
Okay, in rail. Rail is an important part of what you call your logistics system. In fact, it drives the basis of a lot of connectivity that you need. So if you think in linkage economy, that focus on rail is absolutely important. So that's a very good priority. The road networks, I don't see how the budget that we have on roads is going to optimize and maximize the kind of productivity that we must have. So if you're still talking in terms of the scale of this investment, this is like, you know, on the margins. You know, we're not there at all. I am looking for a kind of mental shift that gets us to look at these numbers that I'm holding out. You need 28 to 30 trillion annual investment in order to deal with everything that you call infrastructure. In the case of Africa as a whole, Africa does need an annual investment of some $93 billion additional in order to achieve that level of productivity of investment. And so what you can tell is that a federal government that at most can offer 2-point-something trillion is far from where it must be going. So, and you know that that's like maximum that it can do. So what it means is that the private sector, new ideas on how to mobilize the investment possibilities that we have.
Dr. Obi, when the president gave his speech, one of the things that he really kind of emphasized on is this notion of creating the enabling environment, whether it's fighting corruption or whether it's trying to work on the ease of doing business, improving the ease of doing business so private sector will come in and fund infrastructure. He mentioned some actual projects that are on ground right now. He talked about the Lagos-Ibadan railway that will eventually link up with the Kaduna to Kano railway by the end of 2019. He said, according to the president, that particular rail line is the key strategic link between the north and the south economically in terms of agricultural products, etc. And then on the eastern corridor, he talked about the Port Harcourt to Maiduguri standard gauge, which he said will be done by 2021, along with the coastal rail line from the Niger Delta, Lagos to Calabar. With these kinds of linkages, with a paucity of funds, would you say that there is a need for the federal government to look outside for funding the way that they have been? Or do you think that they should focus on just priority projects with the little funds that they do have?
You know, that would be a pity for us to accept our current low equilibrium as what we can do. We must think in a very disruptive manner of the options that we have. Mobilizing from abroad is important, but I'm not saying, you know, mobilizing fund is not the equivalence of, you know, having episodic agenda for borrowing. You have to think of this in a completely different way. What would borrowing do? What would direct investment do? What would public-private partnership do, where you're doing leveraging? You know, so there are many dimensions to looking at this. If we then looked at it that way, what would happen is that the other actors in solving various infrastructure gaps that we have, whether it's roads. With roads, you've got the trunks, the highways. Then you've also got the rural roads. When you look at, you know, the structure of governance and the various states in the country, I don't think many of them really that much think about the underinvestment in those kinds of infrastructure. And because that's part of their problem. But you can't simply say, oh, you know, those rural roads are not part of the government, of the federal government's responsibility. If you're going to think of shifting us from low equilibrium to a place where we're growing at a minimum of 7% per annum, because that's just what will scratch poverty. Okay, but we need to get to leaps and bounds. If China could do it, we can do it. So if you looked at all of those kinds of infrastructure issues and how we would be able to inject the necessary solutions that include finance, not just finance, but also the technology, then we have to think differently.
Dr. Obi, please just hold that thought. This has been a fascinating conversation. We're going to have more with Dr. Obi Ezekwesili when we return from this break. Please do stay with us.